Hi, this is Jack Neville, and you're listening to the Two Furs Angling Podcast. I'm here with my co-host Matt Kleiber from Puget Sound Fly Company. This podcast is brought to you by Puget Sound Fly Company, a brick-and-mortar fly shop located in Tacoma, Washington. For orders, please call 253-472-2420. They mail all across the United States. And Two Furs Angling, a Washington-based fly fishing guide company with the idea to not only help you catch fish, but teach you how to be a better angler. For booking, please email me, Jack, at twofursangling@gmail.com. That's TWOFIRSANGLING@gmail.com. Two Furs Angling Podcast is here to help all anglers, regardless of style. We bring you up-to-date product information, interviews with industry professionals, tips and tricks on setting up your gear, fun fishing stories, and knowledge at no charge to you, the angler. Episode 6 of the Two Furs Angling Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Matt Kleiber. Today we're going to answer some questions off the Instagram page, and then we're going to talk a little bit about sea run cutthroat fishing and kind of what we like to use for our setups and just some general tips and tricks that we kind of wish we knew when we were getting started cutthroat fishing. Cutthroat fishing can kind of be a kind of a searching game for some people. Some people just can't seem to find them. And there's some equipment things that you can do and some other things that you can do to kind of get those fish a little bit easier. So we're going to talk about that. First off, let's start off with the Instagram questions. First question we got from Dave Bowerman, and he says, describe your most memorable day on the river or creek in the Pacific Northwest. And his follow-up question is, what do you do to replicate that in subsequent trips? So let's start off with you, Matt. What's your most memorable day out on the water?
My most memorable day, memorable.
Yeah, memorable. Yeah,
Jeez.
yeah.
Memorable day. Dude, was like last year. Nope, 2 years ago. I was with Ryan Caldwell from Got Your Six Fishing. We were on a friend's trip.
Okay, sure.
And so it was like,
because you guys are good buddies, so yeah,
right,
super close.
Met him through Project Healing Waters. You know, we're fishing, and there's two boats, and the first boat goes through, nothing.
Yeah.
I go through, and I land. I thought it was a coke, so we were fishing
Yeah.
coho.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there. Boop,
What time
boop,
of
boop.
year is this?
Oh, dude, this is October trip.
Okay.
So,
sure. Kind of that borderline.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And chum were coming in
Okay.
behind him.
Where are you? What?
Chehalis.
Okay, sure.
And so
Which steelhead on the Chehalis, like most of the time guys are going more into the tributaries. Like that's a pretty big river to be fishing for. That's a coho river just because it's super loggy and there's kind of like real frog water for the most part. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was crazy too because it's over by a bunch of structure, and that's where the coho, we're sitting and we're casting, stripping, and this chum, not bright, but like
as bright as a chum can be.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, it was a hog. And
really?
Yeah, it had started the hook going on.
Yeah,
It was gnarly, and it was a big chum.
Yeah.
Biggest chum I've seen like in the waters here.
Yeah.
And so I get it.
Okay.
I've never caught anything like that.
Yeah.
Bulldoggy, like that, all that. So I didn't know what I was doing. So
that's an important thing. Like people don't understand about chum and Chinook is when you hook especially a big one, they just hold there, and it's like literally like who's stronger. Like, can you put enough pressure on this fish to move it? Like you just, especially, I bet you were fishing coho gear, right? Like just coho spinning rods and stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're like busting your butt to try and lift this fish and like doing everything you can to try and move it, and it just like it feels like you're hooked into a rock when you hook those.
And it
big.
feels like it's just tumbling a little bit down the river.
Right, you're like this thing like occasionally he just moves a little bit, and you're like, dude, I can't do anything to force this fish to move.
Dude, it was like a 15-minute fight.
Oh, right. It probably wasn't, but it always feels like it is.
No, I mean, it was that long. Yeah. Where other boats were were dropping
We're
anchor
dropping anchor.
around watching me because I'm over there with an idiot and I'm yanking to the right and I'm yanking to
Yeah,
the
you're
left
trying
trying to
to
turn
put
that
enough
head.
pressure to turn his head. Yep.
So finally, everyone's just like looking at me, taking pictures because I guess my facial expression was just
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
"Oh my god!"
Oh, I
freaking
bet.
out. And yeah, dude, I landed that. Ryan, souped it up, took a
Yeah.
picture with it, and we let it go. But dude,
That's awesome.
that, and then I think we caught like 30 coho that day on top of it
That's
all.
pretty awesome. Yeah, when you get into big pods at coho, man, it's like every cast you're hooking into.
They
them.
were stacked in
Yeah.
there. It was
Yep.
awesome.
That's a killer trip.
Yeah, oh, dude, it was
That's probably
insane.
coho fishing is probably my favorite fishing that there is. I mean, I feel like that's the trips that we talk about probably the most are the coho trips that we do in the fall.
Yeah,
Coho are my favorite fish to catch. They're so cool with how much they jump and they run, and like it's just coho are just such a badass fish.
they're hardy.
Yeah. Well, and like for me, like even when I hooked that last year, I hooked a 40 pound Chinook on gear on a coho trip that we were doing, twitching a big jig. And dude, like it's fun, don't get me wrong, but like you're saying, dude, like it's work to land a Chinook. I'm not going to keep a Chinook on the Quileute system because the returns just aren't that great. I mean, like legally you can keep one, but we wouldn't keep one, like it's just the return isn't there for it. So, for me, that's just not as, you know what I mean? That's not as fun. I would rather catch multiple coho that are going to run. And I like, fishing them on the fly, but I also like throwing Vibrax for them. Like it doesn't really matter to me how I catch a coho, and that's personal preference. I do like catching them more on the fly because they go crazy on your fly rod. Like
it's insane. A coho on a fly rod.
Oh,
so
dude,
cool.
It's awesome. Coho on the fly is one of my favorite things for sure.
Well, nice thing, like we were throwing the coastal quick shooters.
Yeah,
was it a 6 foot?
Yeah, totally. 6 foot fluorocarbon leader.
And just casting, letting it drop. And
yeah, so that's the setup that I do. I got that from Jim Kerr and those dudes. Was you run the coastal quick shooter because it's clear head, and those fish are super spooky. Like they just are. You gotta have some type of a clear head. You can't have like a bright orange or a bright green or something head. It just doesn't work. And then we run all fluorocarbon again down to like 17 pound fluorocarbon, and we're just exactly on our 8 weights, just casting and stripping just like you would out on the sound out of a boat. And where we're doing it, it's pretty deep there, so sometimes you run a poly leader, like a Sync 3 poly leader off the end of your coastal quick shooter, and you're just casting and stripping it back in. It's super mellow streamer fishing, as though you're like on the Yakima or something, but the return could be a 8-10 pound coho. So it's definitely a super cool fishery, and those fish go nuts when you hook into them in that chimney hole. And the coolest part about that is that you like hang out for 20 minutes and then you're good to fish that hole again. Like they just don't.
Well, they just sit there and do that circle
they just
and
don't
gather
well,
more.
and they just don't get bothered by like one of their buddies just getting yanked out of the water and bonked.
Yep.
For me, well, sorry, what do you do now in other trips to try and replicate like that same?
Honestly, dude, I just chase chum now.
Chum
if they're
are
in there,
fun fish, man.
If they're in there, I'm like, let's go coho fishing. I'm like, yeah. Is there chum going on?
Yeah, exactly.
Has anybody caught one?
Chum is a super fun one. I did that trip with Stu to the Green last year.
Yeah.
One mini chum though, but I did hook into a couple. I hooked into one decent coho, and then Stu hooked into probably like 5 or 6 like fire trucks. For those who don't know, a fire truck's like a super bright red old coho that's been in the system a long time. So I mean, for me, I don't know. It's a tough call, like what your favorite trip is, because they all have like parts to them that make them the best. You know what I mean? Like every one of them in my eyes is like a great trip. It's just like individual things happen on each trip that make me enjoy it. I would say tough to beat the first time me and you went fishing.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably one of my favorite ones just because it's such an awesome story. So I knew Matt from the shop. I'd known Matt for a little while. We weren't like super good buddies or anything. I just knew you. You're a cool guy who came in the shop. And I think you came in at probably like 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. And it was a tying night. I remember that. And I was like, hey, dude, I'm going out to Forks in... At that time, it was probably 4 hours. I'm going out to Forks in 4 hours after this tying night. And I was like, I need another dude in the boat. I didn't need another dude. I had a guy out there who was going to fish with me. But I was like, hey, man, like I'm going to go out there. You want to go? And you were like... paused for a minute and you just kind of looked at me like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Like in 4 hours he wants me to go to Forks? And you were like, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah. All right. Yeah, what? I don't have any stuff. And I was like, yeah, I got like all my rods and everything in the car. You just need some waders and boots. And you were like, oh, all right. And I found waders and boots in the back, and you're like, yeah, I could roll with those. But we ended up having to stop by your house anyways, which is on the way from the shop anyways. So you should have just told me that from the start. And I was like, so we stop by your house, you grab all your stuff, and then we get out of there, and we leave Tacoma. It's about a 3.5 hour drive usually.
Yeah.
Out to Forks from the shop. And so we leave at 8:30ish. Stop by your house is probably close to 9 by the time that we're leaving Tacoma. So it's gonna be a late night. We're gonna get in and sleep in the car, and we're morning fishermen. Like we're on the water in the dark for steelhead every time.
Yeah.
Like every time that I've ever put in, and we were gonna float the lower hoe that day. Every time I've ever put in, like you just hear the rocks crumbling off the landslide on the far side of Allen Bar, and you're like, well, it's pitch black. We're just gonna run the shuttle in the darkness, so that way we can get a rig down there really quick. So we do. So we run but so we are heading over. It's a 3.5 hour drive. We're hanging out, talking, and we get finally, after a long drive, we get all the way up to Crescent Lake. And we hit the front, and there's like a construction dude in front, waving people down. And we're like, maybe we'll have to wait like 30 minutes or something. Like maybe they're only down to one lane or something. And the guy goes, hey, the Crescent Lake Pass is closed. You got to drive around. And we're like, what? What do you mean around? Like, and he's like, you got to drive around. You just take, for those who have been from PA over the Crescent Lake Pass, right before you hit Crescent Lake, there's a right-hand turn that goes out to the ocean. And it's a long drive on a very tiny road.
It's like an hour and a half or
Dude,
almost 2 hours extra.
It took at least an hour and a half, because what you do is you drive all the way out to CQ.
Yeah.
So you drove to Crescent Lake, now you drive all the way out to CQ, and then you follow the coast all the way to Nia Bay, basically La Push, and then you drive that La Push road all the way back. So we hit way out there, and then we're heading back, and we finally just accept we're not going to make it to the hoe. It's like 3 a.m. And we're like, all right, dude, let's just sleep at this logging road turnoff in the truck, and then we'll meet Ian, the other guy. We'll meet Ian in the morning at Thrifty. So we're like, all right, that's the plan, because he's staying at the Bogus Shield campground, so it's not a big deal for us to meet him there. So we just pull off on this logging road, and I jump in the truck bed, at that time I still had my old Ford, so I had the big canopy. So I crawl into the canopy. Matt stays in the truck bed. He's sleeping, and I don't know. It had to be like maybe 2 hours later at most, an hour and a half later, because it's like we probably pulled in there at like 2:30, maybe 3.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
probably by about 4:30 in the morning, there's these logging trucks just hauling ass past us, turning onto this logging road. And they're going like 60, and it's like an old beat up gravel road, and it's just like you just hear boom, 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 and we're like, what the like just wake up in your sleep like, whoa, what the hell's going on? Like we're freaking out. And I have this little sliding window on my thing, and I slide the window, and I'm like, Matt, are you up, man? And he's like, yeah, I'm up now. So I'm like, all right, we'll just go into the Thrifty, and we'll get a bunch of coffee and energy drinks, man, and we'll just power through the day. So we meet with Ian at the Thrifty. We put on, we're floating down, and we're nymphing that whole day, and we're just pounding on the hoe. Lower hoe, you get really long drifts nymphing, and we're nymphing, and it's just kind of slow fishing, not like bad fishing or anything. The conditions are a little bit on the dirtier side than probably what's ideal. But we didn't see any other boats really. Flows were a little bit lower because I remember it being a little bit borderline whether or not I could get my old aluminum drift boat down. Because I had a low side, and sometimes like waves would be like right on the edge of that low side. I definitely took that boat a lot of times down water that a low side drift boat was not exactly designed to go down. But it's not bad as long as you point the nose right at it and then take the waves on that way. You go sideways down it, you're going to get a lot of water in your boat. So we get down. We're kind of at like one of my favorite spots, and Joe Pombrio is actually the one who showed me that spot. I remember him talking about it. That was his favorite spot on the river. And I was like, cast right behind that rock, like right there. There's this big rock structure, big rock garden on your way down right before you hit some rapids. That probably isn't there anymore, but no. I'm like, all right, hug it behind these rocks. And so Matt and Ian throw it right behind these rocks. Ian's out of the back of the boat. No, he's out of the front of the boat. Mm-hmm. Matt's out of the back of the boat. And his stuff gets a little bit back toward the back. And Matt is a stickler about you keep your stuff on your half of the boat. If you're in the front of the boat and Matt's in the back of the boat, there's no better way to upset Matt than allowing your stuff to get toward the back of the boat.
Dude, it kills me.
It drives him crazy.
It's like, dude, you need to mend.
Yeah, exactly. Or do something and pull your stuff out of the water because you're floating too slow. Matt's floating too fast. So, yep. So Matt is, it's getting back toward the back, and I can tell, this is going to bother Matt. And then, bam, steelhead on. I don't think Ian noticed it at first because I just see this bobber go down, and I'm like, set. And then he throws a big set in it, and that was Ian's first steelhead. He's a guide sometimes up in the summertime for some coho up in Alaska, so he's not bad at fighting fish or anything. But I just think he wasn't ready for it to run so much. So I was on my old IMX Pros. I had 10-foot 7-weight IMX Pros that we were nymphing with, and that thing was just whooping Ian's butt, man. Like that fish was running. I tried to hold us up above the rapids. He couldn't land it. Couldn't get it back into the slack water that we were holding in. I kind of rode us back up into the slack water, and finally we're like, all right, like he's just not going to be able to land it up here. So that fish was making a run for the rapids. So we push off, we go through the rapids with the fish. Somehow he keeps this thing on this whole time. It's probably at like a 5-minute fight by now. Mm-hmm. We get down below. He's still fighting it. He can't turn it around. So I jump out of the boat with the net. I'm watching the fish, I trip up on a rock and like fall partly in. And then I finally land this thing like maybe like 30 feet down from the boat. He's finally able to get it to turn it toward the bank, and I land it probably like a I don't know, like a 10-pound, 12-pound coho, probably 12-pound coho. Not a bad looking coho or anything,
Steelhead.
steelhead. You're right, that was a steelhead. I apologize. Yeah, not a bad looking 10, 12-pound steelhead. Killer fish. It was a nice looking fish, definitely a hot fish, yeah.
Yep.
But I mean, Ian was just like spent, man. He was stoked that he finally caught steelhead. He'd been doing it for like a year, going out steelhead fishing, and just getting skunked every time. So that was his first time out there floating with me, and he got into one. So good trip. It's always cool too when you like kind of call where it is. You're like, throw it right behind that rock, and then somebody hooks a fish, and you're like, yeah, I know my stuff. Except for the fact that you like called like 20 other spots on that trip and nothing happened.
Yep.
But you just don't focus on that. You're like, no, I knew it was that.
I knew it.
I knew there's a fish. The amount of times that I've been like, I bet you there's a fish behind that rock or whatever because it looks perfect and there's just not, is so high in comparison to the very few times that I've been like, yeah, there's a fish right there. And then you hook one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he was smoking a cigarette and burned. So he had neoprene waders and burned a giant hole in his waders right after that. So that was something too. And then we just floated out pretty much after that. We were all pretty tired. And just kind of forward rode for the most part the rest of the way. Matt kept fishing. I think Ian took the back of the boat after that. It was a good trip. It was cool too, just to get him into his first fish. Yeah, I don't, that's probably my favorite. There's so many that come to mind when I think about my favorite trip. I'm like, what do I pick? Like, I have some awesome chum fishing days. I've got days where I've got lots of cutthroat out in the sound. Like there's just so many. They all have their own like little things about them that I love so much that it's hard to like pick one day that you're like, this was my favorite fishing trip.
Right.
As far as what I do to replicate that, in subsequent fishing trips, honestly, what matters to me most is who I fish with. Like that's the thing that makes or breaks a fishing trip. Because if I'm out there fishing with Matt and Bennett or Stu or whoever it is, one of my buddies, like if you're out there with somebody who's got a positive attitude, regardless of the fishing conditions, and can BS with you, that's what matters to me. Because even like what comes to mind is when it was like crazy windy and pouring down rain with you and Bennett. Like I don't remember that trip as being a shitty trip. You know what I mean?
No, and it was downpouring.
Dude, it was like almost like to the point where you're like, is this hail or is this just rain just beating my face? And yeah, I remember we were joking that it was God punishing you, and then Matt stands up on the front of the boat and puts his arms out, and he's like, bring it on then. And then all of a sudden a giant gust of wind just slams into the boat and like pushes us upstream. And Matt was like, all right, I get it. Sits down.
All right, very well. Okay, you got me.
So for me, dude, it's all about who I'm fishing with. Because even in the shittiest conditions, if I'm fishing with my good buddies and we're BSing and making jokes, like even though you're suffering the whole time, it's still a fun trip.
It is. Yeah. Definitely. We've been through some weather.
Dude, just some brutal trips.
Yeah.
I honestly, like every time that I think about one of our Forks trips, I don't really think that I have any trip that's just gone smoothly.
Right. Yep.
Like I don't think that I have any trip where we like made a good plan. We're definitely not planners like beforehand usually. So, I mean, I can't think of a time when we had like a plan and just like nailed it and the trip went super smooth.
Yeah, usually even if the other parts of the trip, it's always like getting there, something happens. Or
Or we go to put on the river and I forgot a net or something. Something happens every time. Or we thought it was going to be really nice, but now it's pouring down rain or whatever it is. Something happens.
Yeah, there was the one where we got on the river and floated down, and somehow I broke the tip of my 8-weight, and so I had to borrow your 8-weight. that you had, and I fished that for the rest of the day. Like
Something always happens.
Always.
So yeah, for me, it's all about who I fish with, because even a shitty trip can be an awesome trip if you're with the right dudes.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Because you're just hanging out with your buddies at the end of the day, you know. So yeah, I mean, I feel like that answers that one. So next one, SC Ben Hart asks, entry level switch for coho and cutthroat. I assume that you're talking about resident coho. If you're not, if you're talking about migratory coho, that is a very, very different question. So we'll kind of answer it in two parts then. We'll answer it first off, kind of what you would say, you know, so this guy comes in the shop, what would you say if he's talking about resident coho? Because he's not here, so we can't ask him.
So if he's talking about resident coho and
yeah, what's your go-to for an entry level, you know, switch for coho?
So it's hard to say, because if he's asking, can you do both?
Yeah,
the answer is no.
I assume he's asking, can he do both? And I think he's probably talking about just out in the sound, you know, fishing for resi coho and fishing for cutthroat, and that's doable. For sure. Like I mean, especially in the winter, now it's kind of, you know, fishing for resi coho now it's a little bit questionable. But if you're talking about migratory coho and cutthroat, definitely not the same. I mean, you're talking about a 10-pound fish versus like a half-pound fish. So drastically different there. If you're referring to resident coho, totally doable. I mean, most of the time in the wintertime, resi coho are kind of anywhere in that. I mean, it depends on the fish, but anywhere from about 12 inches, and then they grow all the way up to about 20. So that's doable.
Right.
Because that's about the same size range as cutthroat, which I think the resident coho actually fight much better than the cutthroat.
That's why I like using a 3-weight, like trout spay.
Well, especially I assume that's what this guy's asking. So what Matt has a setup for that. So Matt's setup for that is a 3-weight Redington dually, the switch rod. And he doesn't use it like a switch rod. He uses it like a traditional spay. So he's got a 250 grain OPST on the end of it. And what do you run, like a poly leader or something? Like a slow sink like poly leader?
Slow sink or like a clear intermediate.
Yeah. So you can change your poly leaders out to kind of create depth, but you kind of want to stick within that smaller size poly leaders. So you want to stick to like the Sink 3, the Sink 4 intermediate, which is 1.5 inches. So yeah, so I mean, that's definitely doable. That's a killer setup. What reel do you have on that for you?
That I have the old Colorado.
Oh, okay.
One.
So he's got an old Colorado. That's just a click pawl reel.
Yep.
Other options would be like a Galvin Brookie. Again, a click pawl reel. There's two schools of thought when you're out in the salt water. A would be, I want a fully sealed drag, so that way no salt water can get in. But if your fully sealed drag is not actually fully sealed, which most fully sealed drags aren't fully sealed, so there's a lot of reels that claim to be fully sealed that I would turn you away from. That's
even
for
just
sure.
Lamson liquid.
That's what I was going to say.
Perfectly fine.
So yep. So you're looking at $279 for that dually, and then you're looking at $109 on the liquids. Please keep in mind, when you are buying a switch rod, you do not buy the same sized reel as you would for a single hander.
Correct.
So we are talking about a 3-weight switch rod, which means you need a 5 to 6 weight size reel. Okay. So the lines on switch rods do not match up to single hand lines.
Right. Yep.
A 3-weight will not throw a 3-weight single hand fly line.
No, it doesn't.
Very common mistake that people buy reels that are based off of the 3-weight size or the 6-weight, whatever your switch rod is. That is not correct. Make sure that you go at least 2 bumps at a minimum. So Matt likes to throw 250 on there, I believe, right?
Yeah.
You have 275 too, right?
Right, I do. Like usually I use the 275 when it's super windy.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that comes down to personal preference. Starting out, always go with a heavier line.
Right. I totally agree with you on
exactly. 100% that will save your ass. Because you probably don't have great feel. I mean, this is if you haven't spay cast before, this is a totally new thing. There are some basics that cross over between single hand casting and spay casting, but for the most part, it's an entirely new endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely helpful to go heavy. That will slow down the setup for you, give you a lot longer time. There's kind of an optimal time at the back of your back cast where the rod is really well loaded, and you just have to figure out when you do that, kind of get the timing down. The heavier you go, the longer you'll have for that optimal time window for you to start your forward cast. The lighter you go, the shorter that time is going to be. So basically what happens is you go back in your back cast and you're going to wait for a second for that D loop to form, and then you're going to go into your forward cast. What I'm saying is you're going to have longer. You're not going to have to time it as well, where that rod is fully loaded at the back cast. So definitely super helpful to go on the heavy side when you're starting out. So that's my recommendation. I'm 100% with Matt. I think that Redington Dually 3-weight is friggin' impossible to beat at that cost.
It's the best beginner set, at least in my eyes personally. I think it's the best beginner set.
I don't even know about beginner. Like, I mean, that's just such a... If you're not going to do a bunch of trout spay fishing, like if it's just like a funsies rod for you, which it is for you, I don't think you can beat that.
No, not at all.
It's so good. But, I mean, the line setup that we just talked about, you said switch in particular. You didn't say spay. So I don't know if you're hoping to be able to do overhead casting as well. You will not be able to do overhead casting with an OPST.
It's rough. I
mean,
technically
okay, yeah,
you can.
You can, yeah, for
but
sure.
It's rough.
You can do it. I would say don't. It stunts your casting ability. When you're getting started, you get like really locked into like, oh, I can huck it super far, because you're basically like gear fishing at that point. You just got a bunch of weight and monofilament that you're hucking out there. But you're going to get tail-in loops, you're going to get tangles, you're going to get a bunch of issues if you start doing that. So I would steer you for sure away from that. If you want to be able to overhead cast with it, like some guys, especially East Coast guys, like to do that two-handed overhead casting, same rod, I would still steer you toward that 3-weight. What I would do is do a 6-weight coastal quick shooter on there, and then you'd be able to overhead cast it. Same reel. You're still looking at that Lamson Liquid. In my opinion, that's the best kind of entry-level reel. That would be where I would start with for a saltwater reel. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't go cheaper than that, because you run into a couple issues really, but that's the seal on the Lamson Liquid is really good. Mm-hmm. Like that's a really good, that conical drag system is super, super simple and absolutely bomber in the saltwater. As long as you don't mess with it, like don't do anything to the reel. Don't open it. Don't open your drag system. Don't screw with it. The only time that people have issues with Lamson reels corroding from the sound is, generally speaking, when they start opening it and screwing with it.
Right, but the nice thing is with those Lamsons,
the worst,
you can clean them out.
Yeah, the worst thing that happens is you do get corrosion in there. You bring it into the Puget Sound Fly Company if you're in this area, or your local Lamson dealer. We keep all the stuff to clean them out at the shop. So we'll dump your cap and we'll dump your bearing into the trash, basically. You buy a new bearing, that's $15. You buy a new cap, I think that's also $15. So you're out the door $30. We'll scrub the inside of your existing reel, leave it with some salt away in it, overnight, let it dry out, and then we'll pop a new bearing in there and pop a new cap on, and dude, your drag system feels like it's brand new.
It's crazy.
It feels, other than looking at the reel, but if you close your eyes, man, you can't tell the difference between you reeling a brand new off the shelf reel versus your reel. Crazy. So that's why I'm a huge fan of that reel. Huge fan of Lamson reels. I mean, they're like the workhorse, man. Like, they're just so reliable, so bomber, pretty boring, honestly. Like, they're not the coolest looking reels generally or anything, though the new speedsters and the Forces look badass.
Dude,
but
the remixes.
The remixes do look pretty cool.
Remixes and the smoke are
dude,
solid. I actually bought one yesterday from Manil for my muskie. I got
nice. You got the 4?
No, the 9 Plus.
Yeah, which
was the 4. Yeah.
So they switched over like a year ago. I think it was a year ago. From they used to do 1.5 to 3, 3.5, 4 was their numbering system for sizes. They kind of went back to a more traditional sizing system. So now basically it's like a 5 plus, 8 plus, so on. So Matt's talking about the biggest size, which used to be the 4. It's now called the 9 plus. So super badass reels. Remixes are a step above. So it goes liquid, remix, guru, speedster, light speed, force. So remix is still a cast spool. So your liquid reel is fully cast. And then the remix is a machine anodized housing. A little bit more durable. Honestly, even the liquid, if you take good care of it, you're not dropping it or anything, you're not going to have a problem with it being cast.
Cheap.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's $50. It's always half the cost. So it's $50 for a liquid spool. So for sure, it's definitely a cool setup. So yeah, just to kind of summarize, 3-weight Redington dually is the rod, regardless of how you want to cast it. Line choice kind of comes down to what you want. You can do basically a 6-weight coastal quick shooter if you want to overhead cast it. If you would like to spay cast it, which I would highly recommend, just because it's fun, it gives you a lot more opportunity. There are a lot of places where you need no back casting room, and you can still huck out there 40 feet with a spay setup. If you're going the spay setup route, your options are, I mean, you got a lot of options. You could go OPST with a monofilament running line. That's a little bit harder for you to strip in, but you get a little bit more distance out of that. But that is a floating Skagit head, so you're not going to get the same depth that you would out of that coastal quick shooter. You can kind of make up for that by going with a little bit heavier poly leader, but you're still not going to get quite the same kind of depth that you would with the coastal quick shooter, because that's a full intermediate line. So it's just different. If you did want to go that intermediate route, you can do the SA Spay Light, and they make a full intermediate in that, and that one's integrated. The integrated part is nice because basically after you've cast out, you can just strip in like it's a normal fly line into your stripping basket. You definitely need a stripping basket regardless of which choice you go with. Less so with the monofilament line, but definitely if you've got the fly line, you want a stripping basket to strip into.
Yes.
So and then, from there you just need poly leaders. You're either picking that Spay Light intermediate or you're picking that OPST. Both of them you want. I think the Spay Light comes in a 260 grain, they call it, but it's the same difference. So you're either going 250 OPST or you're going Spay Light, or you can do the Skagit Max Short from Rio too. They do that all the way down to 250 grain. If you wanted, I like the OPST one a little bit more. It's a little bit shorter than the Skagit Max Short, so I'd recommend that over. But if you got like a, you really want a Rio product or something, you can do that. Airflow makes a pretty good one too. Skagit Scout, you could do that in 250 grain. The OPST lines are made by Rio anyways, so if you got a problem with Rio, you're gonna end up with a Rio line if you own an OPST. So there's only like 3 line manufacturers in the world, so most of you guys are buying Rio lines, you just don't know it. So And honestly, there, if you read online, people have issues apparently with the durability of, for example, the Coastal Quick Shooter, or the durability of kind of Rio lines in general. It's not an issue. I mean, like, I think those people are frankly lying. Because when we worked at the shop, people would return a fly if they think it didn't perform to their expectations. So 110%, if a guy was having his fly line falling apart on him, he was definitely bringing it back to the shop. And
if your fly line's falling apart on you, like if on the beach,
yeah,
you need to, and you don't have a basket,
that's what I was going to say.
You need
I
to
think
check.
I think a lot of people don't have baskets and they're stepping on their fly line.
that's shreds them, and they're like, oh,
When you're
whatever
fishing
it
the
is.
sound too, you're fishing over like oysters and all sorts of like really brutal sharp stuff. And I think these guys aren't stripping in fast enough, and they're hanging up on it.
I'm
And
putting too heavy of
cutting-
poly leaders on.
Yeah, putting too heavy of flies on and poly leaders, that definitely will get you down and cause you to hang up on the bottom a lot too. So you got to be careful out there. I mean, like, your line is expensive. A stripping basket is a legitimate way to protect your fly line, especially if you've got an intermediate like a Coastal Quick Shooter. Like, your stuff will hang up on the rocks below you. You will stomp on it if you do not have a stripping basket.
Yeah,
Like,
I
it
didn't have a
just
stripping
happens.
basket, and last year for pinks,
Yeah.
I went through 2 coastals because
Yeah.
I kept stepping on
Yeah.
it there.
And we were at Browns Point, like, which is a sandy beach. Like, that's not even a brutal beach. Like, if you're out at Purdy or something, dude, you could wreck your fly line in an hour, stepping on it like that. Like, it's, yeah. So yeah, you got choices there. Basically, any 6-weight fly line will work just fine. If you want to do a single hand one, I highly recommend the Outbound Short from Rio. That's another killer one. Or doing the Coastal Quick Shooter. I like the Coastal Quick Shooter a little bit more because it's a little bit more delicate, cuts through the wind a little bit better. Or the Outbound Short is a nice one because it's like real short and aggressive, so it's a little bit easier for you to cast if you're new to the two-handed overhead casting. But I would say the Spey line is the way to go. I'd probably do the SA intermediate if it was my choice. Now, if you're talking about migratory fish, totally different. You're talking about migratory fish, you're looking at a 6-weight. 6-weight rod, 6-weight switch rod. You could still do the dually. You could still do the Lamson liquid. You'd switch to the 8+ or what they used to call the 3.5. Which is an 8 reel. Just, again, you're 2-bumping it. If you wanted to do a quick shooter, same deal, go up to an 8-weight. If you want to do a Spey line, I think you're looking at about 350 grains on that. Honestly, I might even do a little bit more. You might even go up to 400 because I throw 360 on my 5-weight. But I tend to like, on my 5-weight dually, but I tend to like a little bit heavier stuff. So anywhere from 350 up to 400 on that 6-weight. Check your recommendations when you look at the rod. Just look on Redington's site, click on the 6-weight. It'll give you a grain window. Pick the top section of that grain window. Super simple. All right, that answers that one. Next one, we got Alex Shrek 8 asks, what are some simple traditional Spey fly patterns to tie? I assume you're talking about traditional in the sense of like non-articulated single hook, old school ones. So some super simple ones. Honestly, the old patterns work really well, but they are really tough to tie. Like, even though they're simple, like you got to be really good at the fundamentals of tying and choice of thread wraps and like they're just brutal to tie. Like, I personally can't tie a very good looking Winter's Hope or any of those summer run flies.
Oh, dude, you don't come to me when it comes to
yeah, exactly.
traditional
Yeah.
at all.
So I would say some simple ones would be like Green Butt Skunk. You could do Skycomish Sunrise. That's not too bad. Winter's Hope is a pretty mellow one too. And all those work. I don't know if you're looking to do summer or winter run fishing or what you're looking to do or how traditional really you mean. But those are some pretty traditional, like, hook, non-articulated, like old school Alec Jackson, or you could do the T10Hs from Gamakatsu.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some classic, patterns. If you're not dead set on that, I mean, honestly, I don't think that the classic patterns work that great. They just don't have very much movement. That's why most people fish different stuff now. Honestly, if you're just looking for something that works really well for steelhead, I'd tie like a wombat. A wombat's like a fly from like the 2000s, basically. That's pretty much a multicolored marabou on the back. It's usually articulated. Doesn't have to be. Like, you can tie any articulated pattern on a non-articulated or a non-articulated on an articulated. It doesn't really matter. But traditionally it's articulated, and it's 2 colors of marabou basically in the back with a little prop behind it, and then it's some lead eyes and some dubbing on the front, some ice dub around the eyes to give it some flash. And then I think usually guys do like 2 things of pearl flashabou on top. So, I mean, that's about as simple as it gets. If you're doing summer run fishing, I think you can get away with throwing traditional patterns. Like, that's kind of the time where throwing
green butt skunk.
Yeah, so a green butt skunk's a really good pattern in the summertime. So yeah, I would say that that's totally doable in the summertime. Whereas vice versa, wintertime, you can't really. I mean, like, you can throw them, they just don't provide enough flash and movement, in my opinion, to perform really well.
Not a big enough profile for me
in higher water conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I don't think you can beat like a rabbit leech, honestly, with like a hot bead. So
pretty much an egg sucking leech.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah,
like,
egg sucking leech. If you're throwing an egg sucking leech, dude, I think you can throw an egg sucking leech year round and crush fish, any fish. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that gives you some good ideas there. And then we got Nolan_Myers asked, the current condition of Washington fisheries is nymphing for, he says W, I assume he means wild, is nymphing for wild steelhead out of a boat ethical? Big topic of debate, honestly. Like, there is a huge push in Washington state right now for people to go basically not fish out of a boat, but also, I hear a lot of people pushing for swing only. I also hear a lot of people pushing for wild fish only. So, I mean, it's a super controversial topic in Washington state in particular due to the low returns. I mean, like, there just aren't huge returns of steelhead coming back anymore. And so I think everybody's kind of looking at it and trying to figure out, like, a solution, really, while still being able to fish. But look, what I would say is, and I got this from John McMillan, is catch and release mortality rate is around 2 to 5%, regardless of type. Whether you're fishing bait with a treble hook, hooking into these fish and catch and releasing them, or you're fishing spay fly, 2 to 5%. That's not a big gap between them. Out of 100 fish, that's 2 versus 5 fish, right? And that's the difference of fishing bait versus swinging a fly. So do I think that, I think it's a spectrum, honestly. Your efficacy, because realistically there's no ethical way to hook a slowly going extinct fish in the face, fight it, bring it in, grab it, take a picture with it, and put it back in the water. There's just not. Like, if all that matters is efficacy, then you're not going to fish at all. So, or you'd fish with no hook or something. You'd be one of those guys. But you're not doing that. You're talking about swinging flies versus nymphing out of a boat. Do you catch more fish nymphing out of a boat? Yeah. If you're really good, yes, for sure. I think the real problem is that most of these wild fish only, spay only dudes have not ever actually nymphed out of a boat. Because I hear on all these interviews and all these dudes like, yeah, it's a normal day for guys to go out there and hook 20 fish nymphing out of the boat. That's the problem. It's all these dudes hooking 15 fish nymphing out of the boat. Was that possible 5 years ago? For sure. For sure that was possible 5 years ago. Like, if you had the best day of the year, it was possible, and it's still possible. Like if you have the day of a lifetime, you could hook 10 fish in a day. The reality, though, I talked to a lot of dudes when I was working at the shop who were nymphing out of boats, and I would say 80 to 85% of them were still getting skunked.
Mm-hmm.
We're not hooking anything. I think that spay fishermen in particular tend to have this little bit holier than thou vibe going on, and they have this idea that like nymph fishing is gear fishing and you are a knuckle dragger for doing it, you know?
Yeah.
And I just, I think that attitude is the wrong attitude to take. I think the attitude of any fishing is lower than your form of fishing is the wrong attitude to take. Because the reality of the matter is look, we're looking at, dude, if your car had a leak in it, right, and you were leaking oil, you wouldn't be trying to figure out the best way to drive around to conserve oil. You'd be like, hey, man, I got to stop this leak. And that's Washington Fisheries. We are losing fish pretty consistently, and everybody's looking at it like, we got to stop these bait chuckers. They're the one that are killing all the fish. We got to stop these, I think you're a little bit crazy if you're like, we got to stop these nymph fishermen out of the boat. I think that you're going to a bit of an extreme there that is just unrealistic I don't think that you're necessarily wrong. Look, I mean, you probably are hooking less fish because I would guess the majority of guys swinging fish don't hook anything for the season. Maybe hooking one fish. Whereas a guy nymphing out of the boat, a normal dude nymphing out of the boat, he might hook like 2 fish for the year. I'd say that that's a pretty average number, right? Like that's what most guys who come into the shop who are nymphing out of a boat do for the year. So, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think that the difference is that big there, that one is necessarily substantially more ethical than another. I think the real issue that we need to solve is getting our fisheries back to what they used to be, to a point where we're not having this question of what is and isn't ethical in terms of how we're fishing. I think that we should get our steelhead numbers back up to a reasonable amount. I think that's what we need to be focusing our effort on. The reality of the matter is that commercial fishing has an extremely large voice in Washington State and in Alaska and in British Columbia because they are a unified front. But the reality of the matter is that we bring in a substantially higher amount of revenue to the state as a sport fishing community. And if we just unified our voice, I think we could cause some serious change, because sport fishing as a whole brings in millions and millions and millions of dollars to Washington State every year, in both fishing licenses sold as well as through the gear that we buy for fishing. Substantially more than commercial fishing. But the problem is that we've got guys in one corner who are like, I want to be able to swing for them only. Anybody else should not be able to fish for steelhead. We got another group of guys that's like, I want to bait fish for them. You should be able to do whatever you want. Treble hooks, you should be able to run gill nets out there. And then you got, I would say, the majority of people in the middle ground that are like, dude, I just want to be able to fish any type of way for steelhead. Let's figure out a solution here. So really what needs to happen is people need to come together, and they need to realize that the problem isn't your other sport fisherman buddy. The problem is big corporations with a unified voice that are out there in the deep ocean or at the mouth of these rivers or in the Puget Sound running nets, fishing for coho or fishing for whatever. Because if you're running a giant net, you're probably landing a lot of steelhead in that net. And that's just the reality of the matter. They're not fishing for them, like nobody's actively running nets out in the Sound hoping to catch steelhead. They're hoping to catch coho or chum or chinook or whatever it is that they're fishing for. Yep. But bycatch is the problem. And I've talked to a handful of biologists from the state that that's basically what they say. Look, man, if we shut down the commercial fishing, within a couple years, we'd have returns like no other again, with very minimal, like if that was the only change. So I think if we shut down commercial fishing and we start to do some habitat restoration on these rivers, and we start to realize that, you know, hey, we got to take care of these rivers, I don't think that wild fish versus hatchery fish or the way that you're fishing is the problem. I think that the real problem is commercial fishing and habitat restoration. So for me, I would say nymphing out of a boat is perfectly ethical. I think it's a lot more difficult than most people give it credit for. I think any type of fishing is more difficult than what guys give it credit for. You know what I mean? Like even if you're fishing bait, it's not easy to land a steelhead, regardless of how you're fishing. It might be easier, but it's not easy, you know?
Right, yeah.
Even if you're really good at bait fishing, you might only hook 3 in a day. You know, like that's not an easy fishing trip. So I think people just got to be more understanding of other people and how they enjoy themselves. I don't think that it's anybody's place to say, my way of enjoying myself out here is more ethical than yours. You shouldn't be allowed to fish this way, you know? So I think we just got to be more understanding of each other, listen to each other, and unify our voice and come to the state with a more unified voice. And that's really how we get voting power, is if everybody comes together as a sport fishing community and realizes what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? If I am a wild, you know, I want to only catch wild fish and I want to swing for them, hey, that your plan to get fish numbers up is just as good for the dude who wants to bait fish for him as it is for you, and vice versa. That bait fishing dude's plan is just as good for you swinging fish as it is for him, you know? And I think that guys are probably right in the sense that there probably should be certain rivers where you shouldn't be able to fish out of a boat. You know, there should be certain rivers where it's single barbless only, shouldn't be able to fish from a boat, shouldn't be able to have lead, right? I also think, though, that it's extremely important in order to get people into fishing to have rivers where you can do whatever you want. You can fish bait, you can fish trebles in order to catch more fish. And there should be a lot of hatchery fish in those rivers, like what the Cowlitz once did. The Cowlitz doesn't get a very good return anymore is kind of the problem there. But for a long time it did. And that kind of served as what we used to call the bonk factory, right? Like that's where guys go to bonk steelhead. And that's what keeps those guys into fishing, spending money with the state, and bringing in more money, bringing in licenses. I think rivers like the Puyallup, for example, should be pretty darn. That's close to a metro area. That brings a lot of new people into fishing.
Yeah.
You think about how many dudes come in when the pinks are in.
It's true. They just load it.
I mean, the amount of guys that buy fishing gear every other year when the pinks are in, they're like, oh, the pinks are in? I haven't fished in 2 years, but I'm going now, you know? And if you had that same level of draw with steelhead, you'd have a hell of a lot of people voicing their voting for the advocacy of steelhead. So it's important to create new advocates for the fishery, right? And I think that hatchery fish do that, because I think you're going to lose a lot of people if you were to get rid of every hatchery in the state right now. If you just went wild fish only, you would have a serious decline in the amount of gear sold all through the wintertime, and you'd have a serious decline in the amount of licenses sold through the wintertime. And that's not good for anybody. That's not good for the businesses that are supporting. That's not good for fly shops. That's not good for guides. That's not good for you, the spay angler, because guess what? There's not much money in the state that is naturally just given to the WDFW to help restore steelhead numbers. It's not there. It's all based off of licenses and people donating to private organizations like the Wild Steelhead Coalition or Trout Unlimited. those are the people getting done these restoration acts. And if you're losing advocates, then you're going to have less and less money for those organizations. And I think if you start banning certain ways of fishing, you're dropping off those numbers drastically. Yep. So spay fishing is such a niche market. I mean, like, it probably makes up, what would you say, like 10% of the greater fly fishing community? So the vast majority of dudes who are steelhead fishing are fishing gear, like by a pretty substantial margin. And I don't think that the spay dudes' pocketbooks are deep enough to keep that fishery alive if it goes to spay only. It is such a niche market, and there are so many people who wouldn't do it that I think you'd just see that would be the death of steelhead in Washington. I know that's kind of a harsh thing to say if you're really into spay fishing, but I think you got to look at it practically. Like I get how in your head that makes sense. You're like, well, we're hooking less fish, even if the mortality rate is, 2%, right? On a catch and release. Most spay dudes only hook and land like maybe 1-2 fish a year. So, right, it'd take them a whole lifetime to kill a fish. And that's true.
It is.
But let's be realistic. The majority of guys aren't going to swing only for steelhead out there. So I just don't see that happening. I think there are more problems that occur with that solution than there are actual solutions. So for me, I think that it's more important that we get more people into fishing for steelhead. And I think that we do that through hatchery fish. And I think we do it through restoration. And I think that's how we create more advocates. Because nobody wants to go fish if there's no fish. When the fishing is slow, that's not when dudes are picking up their spay rods and going, I've never done this, but I want to go out and do it. When fishing's really hot, that's when you get guys who are like, hey, I saw this video, I saw this Instagram post, whatever it is, I want to get into this spay fishing deal for steelhead because there's a bunch of fish. And I think that would be a cool way to do it. Or I want to get into fly fishing for steelhead, right? That's usually how it happens. Is somebody was a gear fisherman for steelhead, and now they want to switch over to fly. So that happens when you've got good returns, consistent returns, and it's not a bear for people to get out to those fisheries. And I think that you do that through kind of sacrificial rivers. And I know that's kind of like sad to say, but the reality of it is the Puyallup gets almost a non-existent return of steelhead, right? It's not really hurtful to the river system to dump a bunch of hatchery steelhead into it. And I know what people are going to say, but then the ocean, right? Like they're going to compete with each other out in the ocean. And you're right there. But you got to kind of weigh out the factors, right? Like what's more important? If we bring in a couple $1 million in, overall sales to the fishing community, is that more beneficial than having a empty dead river and those fish not competing out in the open ocean? Tough to weigh out.
But the competing out in the open ocean is the strongest survive. And that's what you want coming back, right?
Yeah. And the big thing with wild steelhead only guys is that they're like, well, the hatchery fish are less fit because a lower percentage of the fish released come back versus fish released wildly, right? Like that cross over the line at the mouth. The issue that I have with that is natural selection has already taken place on the wild fish as smolt. It's already weeded out for the strongest fish, right? In a hatchery fish, every fish survives. And then they release them, and then natural selection picks off the weak ones.
Well, and they still have to go out and come back.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So, I mean, like, right, it's not that the fish are less fit. It's that you made sure 100% of the eggs made it to adulthood and now are being released. Instead of most of them would have got picked off. If you just, were out as wild fish, most of those fish would have died as smolt. So it's not that they're less fit. It's that the culling happens much later in those fish. So the whole, hatchery fish are less fit than wild fish, I don't think is necessarily true. I think that the culling just happens much later, so we get a definitive number of how many fish are actually capable of making it out into the salt water. I think if you started going around and counting the number of eggs versus the number that return as adult steelhead, you'd find that the numbers are probably about the same. And I don't know a single dude who can tell the difference when he hooks into a steelhead. I don't know anybody who hooks into a steelhead and goes, man, that's a hatchery fish. This one's fighting like a wet rag. You can't tell. When you hook into that fish, you got no idea if it's a hatchery fish or a wild fish. That's just the reality of it.
Hey, the only way you know is when it gets to the boat.
Yeah, you're like, clipped, or not, and right. That's it. I think wild fish do tend to come back a little bit bigger. But that depends on the river, because if you look at the natives over on the Quinault, they got some seriously big hatchery fish. Their problem is that they're not diversifying by bringing in other rivers and mixing the gene pool. And so if something were to go wrong there, like a disease or something was to start spreading, they'd lose their entire return of fish. So that's a really risky gamble that they've got going on there. But through a brood stock program, they produce very, very large hatchery fish. So, I mean, it all comes down to what you want to see out there. I mean, I think that really what we all want to see is one thing. We all want to see steelhead numbers go up, in particular wild steelhead numbers go up. And I think everybody argues about the way to do that. But the reality of it is the real way to do that is to get the WDFW more money. Get the people who are actually educated, who are paid by the state for their ability in biology, to get those numbers up. And the way that we do that is through license sales. The way that we do that is through more people becoming advocates and donating to Trout Unlimited, Wild Steelhead, whatever it is that you want to see on the forefront. That's the way that we do that. I think that hopefully answers your question. I think you were just asking for our opinion, and that's my opinion on the matter.
Yep.
Be happy to talk about it more, maybe on a later podcast. Real quick, we'll just go over what's your setup right now for cutthroat fishing. What are you out there using?
I mean, usually if it's a single hand, I like the
You like to single hand fish for them?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I do both. So you see, I bring both. I bring two rods at all times. So I mean, usually
you bring a lot more than two rods. You just fill my cart with stuff.
Well, yeah, I gotta,
It could be a day.
Fill it. So
it could be a day trip, and Matt would have like 40 bags. He'd be like, "Well, what if we decide? What if all of a sudden there's a bunch of Chinook returning? I got my 10 weight in the car just in case."
Hey, you got to be prepared.
Yeah, like, Matt, it's the middle of winter. It's February, and he's like, "You never know."
Yeah, hey, you don't. You got to be prepared. That, and you got to have clothes. You got to have food. You got to have ways to cook your food. Like. I mean, who knows? Yep. We tip the boat and we're stuck there, and I have the jet boil, and we're like, exactly. We'll just boil water and we'll be warm.
Yeah.
So, all right,
using single handers.
back to the single handers.
Yep.
I like a 5-weight 10 footer. That's my personal.
Sure.
I'd like the.
Which one do you have? Yeah, what 10 foot 5 weight do you have?
I actually have the Echo Ion.
Oh yeah.
And it's actually great for the.
It's a pretty good beach. Rod. It's a little heavy, and it's a little slow for me.
You just got to kind of, at least me, I had to even it out with a reel. You know what I mean? And
a lot of guys, a lot of guys do that. Go with a heavier reel, and then you don't notice it as much. Yeah, and then you do your 3-way dually.
And then I do the 3-way dually.
Which we already talked about pretty extensively. So I'm with you there. For me out in the Sound, I go between 2 rods, which are definitely lighter than most. So I do a 4-weight with a Galvin Brookie on it, which is a click pawl reel. I got a super cool one that's like half just anodized clear. So like just straight silver, and it's half blue. And I'm really into that. And right now I've got the Cortland line. I think they call it the Beach line.
The Beach line, yeah.
Is that what they call it? The one that's at the shop, yeah. Which is an intermediate head and then a floating running line. Gary Sandstrom gave that one to me. So, and I told him that I'd fish it. So that's what I've been fishing on there. I one bumped it. Oh, my 4-weight's a Sage Foundation, by the way. A little bit faster. Really lightweight rod. Super into the Foundation.
Outstanding rods.
Oh, dude, it's for $325. That is a ridiculous price for how good that rod is. Unreal how good that rod is. So, yep. So I fished that 4-weight, and that's pretty much my go-to as far as cutthroat fishing. If it's windy out, if there's not wind, like not brutal wind, I'm using my 2-weight. I got a 7'6" Pro 4X, which is a little bit older G Loomis rod. And that's a 2-weight. And then I have a prototype OPST line that James Awasi gave me a while back before they came out with the Groove. So it is the Groove line, but it's integrated. So it's got a floating running line to it, and that's got an intermediate head. Super, super cool line. I really like it. On that one, it's 150 grain that I'm throwing on that 2-weight, and then I throw, I think, a Sync 3 7.5 foot poly leader, one of the shorter poly leaders. That's kind of my go-to for out in the Sound. For the most part, that's what I'm using. I'm super into that rod because I double haul when I do it with the single hander, so I can get pretty good distance. I can get like 40, 50 feet out of that pretty easily. I'm fishing quick with that because I'm not false casting or anything, so it's like really efficient for me to fish with that. And when I do hook fish and land them, it's freaking awesome. Like they fight like crazy on that. Like I can land little resis, I can land little coho, I can land a little cutthroat, and it still feels like a big fish. And when I do hook into a big fish, it's freaking awesome. Like they run and jump. It's awesome. So those are kind of my 2 go-tos. And then, for reel on that one, I throw a Click Paul Redington 0. So both my reels are Click Pauls for out in the Sound, and then I just wash them clean. When there's bigger fish like the big resis and stuff like that in the springtime, I'll fish I got a 591 Sage X from George Cook, and I throw that same line. Actually, I just flip over my Galvin with that 5-weight, and I just throw that on there. Unless I'm fishing out of a boat. If I'm fishing out of a boat, that's an important difference. I fish a completely different line and setup out of a boat. Out of a boat, I will fish the Striper 250 grain on that 5-weight, which is kind of like a 6-7. So it's a little bit heavy for that rod, but it casts just fine. But that gives me more depth out of a boat. Like I want to sink more out of a boat because you're following the contour the other way. So you want it to continually sink while you're stripping in and follow that contour because that's where the fish are holding. So I fish that heavy sinking 250 grain, and that seems to work really well for me out of the boat. Also David Dietrich from Adventure Angling. That's what he's using too. So I think he throws those on a 4-weight though. But that's a killer setup. I mean, it sinks really good. I think he's throwing on his 4-weight, he's using the SA Sonar 200 grain sinkers because it's a little bit lighter weight, throws a little bit better on the 4-weights. I have that line. I use that if I'm going to use a 4-weight. 4-weight for me is the optimal size for cutthroat. You like a 5?
Single hand, I just 5 because you never know what you're going to get into. I mean,
that's
it's
true.
The Sound.
You can hook a bigger fish for sure.
Right, exactly. Something cruising through. So, I just, and I think that's what I started with, and that's
sure. Yeah, no, I started.
Size,
I started with a 6-way Echo base, and that was pretty good for me when I started out. And then I had an outbound short on there, which is a good starting outline too. Yeah. Well, that does it for today. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Check in next week.